Namaskar and welcome to Indian Diplomacy, show on national television about India's foreign policy, India's increasing footprint and influence in different regions of the world, India's major partnerships with important countries and institutions, and also how India is being seen as a leader and a provider of solutions to global problems. Viewers, in this episode, we are looking at the interconnected phenomenon of business and foreign policy. Economic diplomacy is a very important element of foreign policy, and increasingly we find that India is taking a lead role in bridging the gaps between the business community, the Indian business community, the international business community, and our policies, both domestic and international. So we are going to be looking at how all of this is working, and to discuss this, I have with me a very special guest in the studio. Let me introduce you to him, Mr. Prasenjit Basu. Prasenjit Basu is a well-known author and a writer of multiple books, the most recent one being Asia Reborn, a history of the entire Asian continent, comprehensive book, and he's also chief economist of ICICI Securities, an important financial firm in India. Welcome to Indian Diplomacy, Prasenjit.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Prasenjit, when we talk of business and foreign policy, the first thought that comes to mind is, have we got the balance right between the market and the state? I mean, that's a very fundamental conceptual issue, and historically post-independence we had adopted the dirigisme and the whole socialist model, which was heavy tight control over the economy and our market players, and that had also put off a lot of international community, and they had written us off. But lately there have been a lot of reforms and changes. Prime Minister Narendra Modi says the business of government is not to do business. Yes. He has spoken about maximum governance, minimum government. So there have been a lot of efforts to make the state a facilitator of business rather than an obstructor or as a gatekeeper. And that big change, I think, is part of the story. When we say business and foreign policy, we need to put this first in perspective. So your thoughts on how state market balance or the government private sector balance has gone in India, especially in the last few years?
Well, I think it's improved dramatically over the last 8 years, and the world is taking notice. If you look at India's equity market performance this year, at a time when most of the world was doing really badly in terms of equities being sold off around the world, India held up very well, and India began to see inflows of capital from July onwards this year, partly because India is now looking much more attractive, having deregulated. If you look back to history, at the end of the Second World War, during the Second World War, India had a tremendous system of controls in place. And unfortunately, the new governments that came in post Second World War, the Dominion government of India and then the Republic of India after 1950, continued with policies that basically were very dirigist, and the comprehensive controls that India had were far more comprehensive than almost any capitalist economy in the world, perhaps even more than many so-called socialist and communist economies.
Like suffocating type.
It was absolutely suffocating. The panoply of controls that existed, some of them were removed in 1991, but many remained in place. And this government has done very well to reduce the regulations dramatically. It has drastically cut down regulation, and as a result, India's rankings in the ease of doing business reports that the World Bank used to publish until last year. They stopped publishing because China in particular was shown to be manipulating those reports. But those it's very clear that India has become a much easier place to do business, and ease of living has improved as well, as the government continues to stress. Coupled with all of this, there's been a dramatic reduction in the corporate tax rates. India now has one of the lowest corporate tax rates in the world, at an effective tax rate of 25%. The official is 22%, but with surcharges it comes to about 25%. For new manufacturing units, India offers a 15% tax rate, an effective rate of 17%. Now, if you go back to the Arthashastra of Kautilya, he says that a dharmic government taxes only 1/6 of income. So, in terms
finally we have the dharma of the state.
We finally got to a dharmic taxation rate for new manufacturing units. With this greatly reduced taxation rate, India is now extremely competitive with the rest of the world. Now, I lived in Asia for 35 years, and the rest of Asia, East Asia, Singapore and so on, and there rates of taxation were always a lot lower, and people used to remark on the fact that India is a high tax regime. But now that is no longer the case. India is now competitive with even Singapore in terms of corporate tax rates, and the 17% rate is actually competitive with anywhere in the world. So that makes it a very attractive place.
Huge difference. Yeah. So viewers, India is changing, and our attitudes to business, both the domestic business and foreign investors, has changed a lot. And as Mr. Prasenjit Basu just told us, there is a sea change, and in the Narendra Modi era, there's been like a second wave of reforms that have unleashed the entrepreneurial potential of our country as well. Let's hear from the man himself, Prime Minister of India, talking about this transformation and how India is open to business and why it's the best place to do business. And he's been like our main global salesperson in chief, and there's no better person than him than to tell us how much India has been changing on the question of business. Let's hear him.
आज भारत ईज ऑफ डूइंग बिजनेस को बढ़ावा दे रहा है, सरकार के दखल को कम कर रहा है। भारत ने अपने कॉरपोरेट टैक्स रेट्स को सिंप्लीफाई करके, कम करके उसे दुनिया में मोस्ट कॉम्पिटिटिव बनाया है। बीते साल ही हमने 25,000 से ज्यादा कंप्लायंसेस कम किए हैं। भारत ने रिट्रोस्पेक्टिव टैक्सेस जैसे कदमों में सुधार करके बिजनेस कम्युनिटी का विश्वास लौटाया है। भारत ने ड्रोन्स, स्पेस, जियोस्पेशियल मैपिंग जैसे कई सेक्टर्स को भी डीरेगुलेट कर दिया है। भारत ने आईटी सेक्टर और बीपीओ से जुड़े आउटडेटेड टेलीकॉम रेगुलेशंस में बड़े रिफॉर्म्स किए हैं। साथियों, भारत ग्लोबल सप्लाई चेन्स में विश्व का एक भरोसेमंद पार्टनर बनने के लिए प्रतिबद्ध है। हम अनेक देशों के साथ फ्री ट्रेड एग्रीमेंट के रास्ते बना रहे हैं। भारतीयों में इनोवेशन की, नई टेक्नोलॉजी के अडॉप्ट करने की जो क्षमता है, एंटरप्रेन्योरशिप की जो स्पिरिट है, वो हमारे हर ग्लोबल पार्टनर को नई ऊर्जा दे सकती है। इसलिए भारत में इन्वेस्टमेंट का ये सबसे बेस्ट टाइम है।
Viewers, you just heard from the Prime Minister of India about this transformation in the relationship between the state and the business, and he specially mentioned all the deregulatory reforms that have taken place. Prasenjit ji, Prime Minister has been going around the world from the day one he took office, or even before that when he was Chief Minister of Gujarat, wooing the international business community to come to India, to make in India. This has become, of course, a signature call of Indian foreign policy. He's even been asking our diplomats to do more in their foreign missions to attract greater inward FDI into India. And this, the results are showing. Last financial year 2021-22, we almost got 85 billion US dollars in inward FDI. And when Prime Minister came to power 2014, it was just around 45 billion on average. So at this rate, you know, the potential is quite high. I looked up the World Investment Report of the UN, which says that we are number 7 now in the entire world in inward FDI, in attracting foreign capital. So that has been a success story, and both in the terms of the commitments and the actual flows coming into the country for manufacturing and in services and all that. So How do you think this has happened? I mean, obviously a lot of policy reforms have happened, Prime Minister was mentioning them, but also India is changing. It's become more receptive to foreign capital. At a time earlier, the attitudes were somehow to look at these, in terms of the East India Company or something, they'll come and colonize us, and that sort of mindset has changed, isn't it? What is your, you've been watching this closely, you've been tracking it. How much has Indian society and the government machinery and all of this shifted gear, and what is the perception of foreign investors as they're looking at India now?
Well, India is now looked at much more positively, and particularly under the Modi government, because India is seen as a conducive place to invest. It is increasingly seen as a conducive place to manufacture as well for the world. And in some areas like electronics, where India was completely absent, there's been a huge increase in investment flows, FDI coming in, and now we're beginning to see that electronics exports, which were negligible from India, are now about 6% of India's exports. They've gone from 0 to 6 in the last 3 or 4 years, and we are seeing a quantum leap, and the continued strength of electronics exports coming through. Now, if you look at FDI in the World Investment Reports put out by the UN, India was never among the top 10 recipients. But in the first Modi term, on every year, 2015 to 2019, India was among the top 7. In some cases, second, third, or fourth biggest recipient of FDI. So the welcome mat that has been put out by this government to deregulate the system, make it much more conducive to investors, has already started to pay off. Now, in addition to all of this, there's been important economic reforms, the bankruptcy code, which has helped to clean up the banking system. The banking system had very high levels of non-performing loans when the Modi government came into power, from the previous 10 years of excessive bank credit. So that was cleaned up. We had the so-called dual balance sheet crisis in the Indian banking system and in the corporate sector. So corporates have deleveraged, banks have improved their situation, and of course the bankruptcy code has been a huge factor helping that. Then the GST came in, which basically created a nationwide market, a single market for the nation, which actually improved the ease of doing business across state borders within India.
The country. Yeah.
So we didn't actually have a properly functioning internal single market. We've got that now, and in addition, labor market reforms were brought in September 2020. They have been enacted, but they've been passed by Parliament. They've been signed off by the President, but they haven't yet been notified. They need to be notified and implemented, and once they are, then India can begin to take advantage of the one missing element in India's economy, which is labor-intensive manufacturing on a grand scale. So if you look at even Japan after the Second World War, Japan had about 12 to 14 million unemployed people in a population of about 60 or 70 million at the in 1950, and even Japan began with labor-intensive manufacturing, and the labor-intensive manufacturing, things like textiles, garments, shoes, toys, processed foods, these things helped ensure that within 10 years Japan had full employment. And you had the similar experience in other places like the so-called Asian tigers.
Yeah. South Korea,
Taiwan,
yeah.
Singapore, Hong Kong, and then later some of the ASEAN economies like Malaysia, Indonesia. Indonesia hasn't achieved full employment, but Malaysia, full employment. Thailand, full employment. So these are all cases that began with labor-intensive manufacturing, grew that to scale, and achieved prosperity as a result. So that is, if there's a missing element in India, that is the one.
We need to do
missing.
more of that.
No, so this government has taken the steps, taken the important legislative measures to get that in place. And what is now required is implementation.
Absolutely. On this point, Prasenjit, many people say that India can be the next China, and that we can attract a lot more FDI than we are currently, because Chinese historically have done more than double or 2.5 times of what we have been receiving. But now, given the risks to supply chains, the trust factor with China, a lot of countries are talking about diversifying away from mainland China. But the buzz is that Vietnam has received a lot of this outbound capital from leaving China, not as much India as we should be. So do you see 5-10 years down the line, with these kind of policies and the wooing of global investment community, that we could actually do this labor intensive manufacturing, maybe not the same sectors that the Chinese have done, but in other fields where we have core strengths? Do you see this that we could actually become a middle income country? It's not just about $5 trillion, $10 trillion, right? It's also about raising per capita incomes, and it looks like with the right kind of mix of domestic and foreign policies, we can achieve that.
Absolutely. I mean, and I think we need not give up on the sectors that China currently dominates, and that Vietnam is beginning to get into now. Not just Vietnam, Bangladesh as well. So Bangladesh is doing garment manufacturing. Vietnam is doing textiles, electronics, many of the areas, consumer electronics. Those are areas that China is beginning to vacate. It's ironic that multinationals are choosing to go from one communist country, China, to another communist country, Vietnam. Those are attractive in the sense that they claim to be dictatorships of the proletariat, but in fact they suppress the proletariat very effectively. And we actually have the opposite problem. We have democracy. We have democracy. We have labor market rules and regulations that supposedly make us less attractive. Now, some of those things are being reformed, and I think in particular, India now has something called a contract labor law, which basically allows you to have fixed term contracts for labor, which overcomes some of the issues of flexibility in the labor market. And so if you look at India's textile and garment exports today, they are about 1/8 to 1/9 of China's. That is the opportunity. We could take even half that, and our share, our textile and garment exports would quintuple. They would be 5 times what they are now. So there is a huge opportunity.
Viewers, already Prasenjit Basu and I have been talking about exports and trade, and this is one booming sector right now. We have crossed $420 billion in goods exports in the last financial year, and that's been a phenomenal success. And our Commerce Minister Piyush Goyal says we may goods and services together touch $750 billion of exports this coming year. So, and with a lot of enabling policies by the government, and this has of course to do with also a lot of free trade agreements that we are signing now, and we are more open to them. Let's watch this interesting report about a recent free trade agreement India signed with Australia, and how this could be a game changer, and continue the discussion. viewers, you just saw a very landmark trade agreement, bilateral trade agreement with Australia coming through, and we have more in the pipeline. Prasenjit ji, the thing is, India has become much more open and interested in these free trade agreements than in the past, and we are less defensive about trade, unlike in the earlier times. So this economic diplomacy has many, it's creating these virtuous cycle that generates more business opportunities both for partners like Australia or the UAE. We have one being negotiated with the UK, Canada, Gulf Cooperation Council countries. There's the European Union itself.
The US as well.
The US also potentially. So this is also part of the story, isn't it, of how foreign policy should enable business, and our commercial diplomacy is really opening new doors, and this is a big change from the past, because we used to be very hesitant about trade agreements. So your thoughts on how this will enable further trade and investment cycles that will boost and benefit both sides? What we are saying is not just India's economic growth or India's prosperity. Here actually we are even arguably bailing out friendly countries, like-minded nations which had been overly dependent on China, and providing an alternative.
So you see, the argument being made in Australia for the importance of the trade agreement with India is that India can replace China as the biggest market for Australia. Now, that is a very valid argument, but it's an argument that will play out over the next 10 to 15 years. Now, for instance, Australia is a major exporter of coal, iron ore, bauxite for aluminium. So now, if you look at the world steel sector, the world's biggest steel producer is China. China produces more than half the world's steel, more than half the world's aluminium. India is the second biggest producer of both steel and aluminium. But India is currently about 1/9 the size of China in terms of its annual production. So over time, that gap is going to close. But one of the reasons why that gap exists is because China is a non-market economy. It keeps investing without thinking about the profitability of new investments. And the rest of the world trades with China as if it's a normal economy. That, not just India, but the rest of the world needs to introspect about whether that is appropriate. Now, of course, the US, the Western world is beginning to wonder about the wisdom of its open embrace of China. And as that embrace becomes a little looser, the opportunity for alternatives to emerge will grow. And the natural alternative is India, because India offers the potential for a huge market, and certainly India's steel production could triple over the next 10 years without really causing too much disruption domestically. So if that happens, then India will suck in a lot of imports of iron ore,
raw materials,
and the potential beneficiary is going to be someone like Australia. So that relationship exists. Similarly, the fact that we've signed an FTA with the UAE is our third largest market. There are lots of Indians, of course, in the UAE, and so India exports a lot. India exports a lot to the UAE, and also to the rest of the GCC. So the GCC is now beginning to want to join the India-UAE FTA. So those are natural relationships. We need to be able to induce global manufacturers to think about India as the alternative for supply chains, and increasingly we need to bring the supply chains that are centered on China away from there and into India. So
absolutely,
some of that is happening in things like electronics. We've seen that about 10% of the new Apple iPhone 14 is going to be manufactured in India by next year. So, and we need to try and make that 20, 30, 40%, and not just Apple iPhones. We need the same thing to happen with Samsung phones. And similarly with the others.
And semiconductors, now we are got a mega investment of Foxconn in Gujarat,
Yes.
$19.1
So
billion.
there are different types of semiconductors. So things like application-specific integrated chips are areas, and then things like television screens and computer screens. So there are parts of the supply chain that
we need to capitalize on, and
we can try to capture and bring in.
Absolutely.
And once you achieve a critical mass, then you get an even greater amount of investment automatically coming in.
And absolutely, the thing is, India is on the move. A lot of positive developments have happened. We have won the trust of the business community, both domestic and the international, and our diplomacy is also aimed at wooing the best of global capital and global technology and global minds to come to India and to do business in India. And this is a very different India from what we had known even 8 years ago. So I want to thank Prasenjit Basu for sharing so many amazing insights with the audience. Thank you so much for being on Indian Diplomacy.
Thank you very much.
So viewers, do think about economic changes, historic changes, and how they happen as a result of positive leadership and a vision with which India is now moving forward. Our commercial diplomacy has found the sweet spot, and that's one of the reasons why there's so much of excitement about the India growth story and about India as a rising economy and a rising power in the world. I'll see you again next time. Until then, take care.